look at an awesome Dutch Commando dagger and see how it compares to the famous Fairbairn Sykes. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. So what we have here is something that's come into my hands with some other things, some antiques I was buying. And I didn't go out specifically looking for it, but I'm very happy it did come to me because it's a really interesting thing. So it is a Dutch Model 1917 Stormdolk, or assault dagger, you could possibly translate that into English as. This is commonly known as a Dutch Commando dagger for reasons I'll go into in a minute. That's more a World War II thing. But originally this was designed, or rather manufactured, from 1917 onwards. There was a lot of trench warfare, and during that period, people found that aside from having their bayonets, this is the British 1907 famous SMLE bayonet, apart from having their bayonets fitted on the end of their rifles, it became often quite useful to have shorter and handier daggers, essentially trench knives. Okay, and we've looked at these and looked at some accounts of their use in previous videos, and you can check those out if you haven't seen those already. Now, clearly, most people could use a bayonet quite happily in their hand, and these are sword or knife bayonets with a hilt on them. They're not just a spike that goes on the end of your rifle. They can be used in hand, and obviously the majority of soldiers would have used these, generally speaking, in the trenches of World War I, but for various reasons people wanted to carry more dedicated fighting knives, and so there was a huge market grew up. I've just grabbed a couple from my collection here. These both date to the early 20th century, and you can see that this has a dropped point. This is essentially modelled on Victorian hunting knives, but they were still being made. In fact, they were made in huge numbers during World War I, and we know that shops were doing a roaring trade in cities like London and Paris, selling these things to soldiers. So how much they were actually used? Well, we know that they were used, and they are mentioned being used in trench raids, both at night and daytime raids of all sorts. So close combat, where your bayonet is mounted by default on the end of your rifle. So whilst, yes, you could use the bayonet in your hand, it's living on the end of your rifle, and it's not that quick and easy to detach it. So having something at your side where if someone jumps on you and tackles you to the ground, that you can pull it out and use it on them is very, very useful. So in 1914 to 1918, First World War, lots of essentially hunting knives and just general kind of bushcraft and outdoors knives started to be sold to soldiers, and indeed there started to be government official versions made for issue to the troops, and there were German and Austrian and Dutch and Belgian and French models of fighting knife, and American and British as well, models of fighting knife that were made during World War I and in varying degrees of magnitude issued to soldiers. And that's really where the origin of this Model 1917 Dutch Stormdolk, I don't have any Dutch pronunciation, I'm afraid, but this is essentially for storming enemy trenches, and this is a fighting knife. So let's have a little look at it. Now, these were made in huge numbers. I understand that something in the region of 30,000 of these were made between 1917 and 1918, whereupon, of course, the war ended. So let's just have a little look at it. First of all, well, let's look at the scab in a second. Let's look at the knife first. So first of all, you've got a wooden grip, and it's actually made in two halves. You won't be able to see this on camera, but very, very subtly you can see there's a line down here. So this is made in two halves. Ribbed, obviously, for grip, and with a fairly large pommel. I'll talk about that in a second. So that grip is made in two halves that conceals a hidden tang inside, and that is secured by two rivets. Now, if we just focus on here, one rivet's down on the pommel there, and the other rivet, I believe they're made of, not sure actually, probably steel actually, up there. Okay, now, so it's essentially got a wooden grip, hidden tang, two rivets holding it in here. We then have a steel or iron ferrule at the top here, and a sort of oval guard. There we go. And we've got a double-edged blade of just over 8 inches. A lot of sources will list these as having 8-inch blades. Most of the ones, certainly this one that I've measured and other people who I've seen have had these online and published the measurements, they're actually just a bit over 8 inches. They're usually about 8¼ inches. It's bigger than a Fairbairn Sykes. It's got a longer grip, it's got a longer blade, and this is, you could say, fairly typical sort of size of a lot of the fighting knives that would have been carried in the trenches, and that's what it was built for. It is the Stormdolk, and it was issued to various different people in the Dutch armed forces. Later on commandos, we'll get to that, but initially it was just general infantry. It was just like handed out to people in the artillery, the infantry, all sorts. So this was a general purpose sidearm backup knife for trench fighting, essentially, and as last ditch self-defense. And I'm sure a lot of them got used for other things. Now, the wooden grip is varnished to protect it. I think it's probably stained darker and then varnished. And the blade, you will notice, has this very attractive bluing. Now, why is it blued? Well, a lot of things were blued at the time. A lot of bayonets, when they were originally issued, actually came with blue blades. And you'll see down at the base of the blade of this SMLE blade, that's blued. The pommel would be blued, the cross would be blued. You will read a lot of things, especially when we start to talk about commando knives, about these being blued for kind of night attacks so they can't be seen and all this kind of stuff. I think the main purpose is purely because it's slightly rust retardant, and when you blue things like gun barrels, whether it's a shotgun, revolver, whatever, or when you blue part of a bayonet, it's largely it won't stop rust, but bearing in mind they're not using stainless steel, it will slightly impede the rust. And as someone who wears armour, I can tell you that blued armour does also repel that sort of that as well. So, double-edged blade. It has a small ricasso in here, and we'll just talk briefly about the markings. It does have government markings on the blade, on the ferrule, and also down on the pommel here as well. And most of them also have and also on the guard up here, and a number, and also we'll find government markings very often on the back of here. I'll come back to the scabbard in a second. So, how does this compare to the Fairbairn Sykes before we move on to scabbard and other details? Actually, it's sort of similar but sort of scaled up, but I've got to be honest with you. I actually prefer the Dutch World War I dagger. I find it's got a bigger, more comfortable grip. I can hold it in a knife fighting sabre grip with my thumb up the back. The blade's a little bit longer. I personally think the Fairbairn Sykes, to me, it always seemed a little bit undersized. I think an 8-inch blade is better than a 7-inch blade. I like the guard, although the guard on this is incredibly similar actually to the Fairbairn Sykes. It's not an awful, it's a little bit bigger, a little bit rounder, but by and large they're fairly similar kind of length. And I said I'd mention that pommel. So one thing I like about that pommel is, if we just put it into the scabbard for a second, you have to bear in mind that in most situations where one of these has to be pulled out in combat, it's because something's gone terribly wrong. So you usually will jump into a trench holding a rifle, maybe some bombs, some hand grenades and this kind of stuff. You won't usually jump into a trench just holding one of these. So very often when you're having to pull this out, it's in a terrible, horrible situation. You're fumbling around, you've got loads of gear on and you're carrying a rifle and ammunition, this kind of stuff. The fact that you've got that nice hand stop at the end in order to find it when you can't look down to see it and it might be dark and this stuff like this, the fact that you've got that, and it's very similar to certain types of historical dagger which have a pommel at the end, or indeed something like a rondel dagger, or indeed even a bollock knife, which tend to have flaring ends as well. So it's similar to historical daggers, and I love the fact that you can fumble around and find that and pull it out really easily. That's absolutely great. Okay, so while you're holding it like this, it might not be the most comfortable grip in the world, but like I say, you have to bear in mind that getting this out is pretty much more important in many situations than actually, once you're holding it, what happens after that. Getting it out is the most important thing. So I actually love that design. I think it's brilliant. In terms of actually holding it, it's a great grip. So these ribs are enough friction to give you a really good grip, and wood inherently is a fairly good grip because it has little, stipples and stuff in the surface. But those ribs definitely help you keep a grip on it. But moreover, They haven't made a cylindrical grip. Now, one of the things I hate the most about certain other fighting knives, certain American ones, we'll maybe do a future video on those, is cylindrical grips. If you've got any kind of edge, kind of makes it really difficult to align the edge, index the edge in the right direction. This is not that. Now, this obviously isn't, you know, it isn't a Bowie knife, okay? So it's not primarily a cutting weapon, it's primarily a stabbing weapon. In fact, this one isn't even service sharpened, so it's probably never issued. But the fact that it has edges, I would like to at least be able to index those edges should I need to. So I love the fact that this is a flatter oval grip, and you can see the shape of the pommel there. And it continues being oval all the way around, and obviously we've got an oval guard, but you've also got an oval ferrule. So it gives you a great grip, great indexing. I like the size of the blade. The shape of the blade, there's nothing to, you know, that is a classic double-edged style blade, as we also find on the Fairbairn Sykes, but as equally you would find on numerous medieval and Renaissance daggers as well, or Indian, Qatar, whatever. So this double-edged kind of flattened diamond section blade with a gradual taper to the tip. It's a fairly strong tip, and I would say as well, one of the problems with Fairbairn Sykes is they had quite fragile tips, because if anything, they were a little bit too pointy at the tip, and a lot of people, and this is an example, this is a third pattern, this has had the tip re-profiled. So very often the tips broke off at the very tip and they had to resharpen them, or they just resharpened them because they knew the tip would break off anyway. So they actually resharpened them to a very similar profile to what the Dutch one already has on it. So I really like the Dutch tip shape because it's not too fragile, but it is obviously still very pointy. So in terms of the weight as well, it's surprisingly light for the size. It feels, I haven't actually weighed either of these, but maybe I should do that, but this actually feels in the hand lighter than the Fairbairn Sykes, even though it's bigger, which I really like. So for its size, it's a really light and nimble little thing. Now, just briefly onto the scabbard. There's a few things to note about the scabbard. So first thing I mentioned about markings on the scabbard. So very often you will look, if you're a collector, you'll look for the serial number on the guard should match the serial number on the back of the frog, which is the bit that connects to your belt, connected to the top of the scabbard. Now, weirdly, and I don't know why this is, my example here doesn't have a number. It's not that the number's been scratched off, it just doesn't have a number. I don't know why that is. But anyway, the number on the guard is quite a late one. It's in the 6,000s, I think. Yeah, 6,500 and something, 77. That's quite a late one. Now, these were made, although I mentioned 30,000 plus, maybe 40,000 of them were made between 1917 and 1918. So there were already a huge number of these in circulation, and yet they were deemed so important and so successful a design that they kept producing them throughout the 1920s and 30s. They only stopped, the Dutch, this is, in 1940 when the Netherlands fell, essentially, to the Germans. So at that point, a few interesting things happened. So there were huge numbers of these in circulation. Now this one, there's a good chance it was never issued because the blade hasn't been sharpened, but who knows, it might have been, I don't know. At that point, some of these were allegedly sent to Norway and used by German forces. I don't know that that's a fact, but I have read that. Allegedly, some of these made their way with Free Dutch to Britain and still carried by Dutch commandos. Now, again, that's something I've heard and I've read. I can't verify for whether that's 100% true, but I have heard that rather than the Fairbairn Sykes, Dutch commandos in British service, fighting as Free Dutch, much like the Free French and Belgians and others, Polish, preferred to keep these, and why not? You could certainly do everything that you can do with the Fairbairn Sykes, you could do with this, and it's a little bit bigger. I actually kind of prefer it. We'll get to a bit more of a comparison in a second. So they continued to be made up to 1940. Some ended up in German hands, some might have ended up in Norway, and some may have ended up in Britain with Dutch commandos, and that's possibly one of the reasons why these are known as Dutch commando daggers. Or it could just be a misunderstanding because they look a bit like commando daggers. But originally they are trench knives, they're trench daggers, Stormdolk. Right, final couple of things about the scabbard, interesting details. So it's leather, It has a little ball at the end to protect the tip, which is metal. The frog is permanently attached via rivets to the scabbard. So in some, for example, bayonets, you have a separate frog. Usually this one would be made of webbing, fabric essentially. And the frog comes up and engages around that button, and that loops onto the belt. That was fairly conventional. Even with hunting daggers, for whatever reasons, they decided to permanently attach this frog to the scabbard. Interesting detail about the frog, certainly this example, I don't know if it's true of all of them, there's a slight slant on it. So if you're wearing it on your right hand side, it would be worn at that angle. So it's not vertical, it's slightly forwards, which brings it closer to the right hand for quickly getting it out, which I love as a detail. So it's slightly pointed forwards with that nice shaped pommel. It's really designed for quickly deploying, quickly getting out. So as I mentioned, riveted all around, very strong, leather. And the final detail to mention is this retention strap. So the original ones, the first version of this scabbard, didn't have that on, and it's without that, as is the case with many bayonets and daggers, probably what they found is in service when soldiers were climbing over things and running around and stuff, these jumped out and got lost or potentially hurt someone, and so they put these retention straps on. Now, in my opinion, because of the short length of the frog, that retention strap is not great. Okay, it's not difficult to get off. I'm being relatively careful with this because this probably dates to, well, at least the 1930s, probably earlier than that. But first of all, to deploy this, you've got to quickly pull that, which it is pointing in the right direction. But when you pull this out, what happens is the guard comes into conflict with that strap quite quickly. Now, you can pull past it. Again, I'm being relatively careful because this is old and I want to look after it. But it does get in the way of the quick draw a bit. So yeah, there we go. Not every design is perfect. In fact, no designs are perfect, are they? But I really, really like it. Now, in terms of, just put the scabbard aside for a second, in terms of a comparison with the Fairbairn Sykes, which would I personally pick? I'd pick this for a number of reasons. Number one, I prefer the balance of it. So it's more balanced, slightly more balanced towards the blade, okay? And that's what I prefer with a knife, and that is normal with a knife. One of the curious things about the Fairbairn Sykes is the point of balance is actually behind the guard. The Fairbairn Sykes actually balances in the grip. Now, this is specifically what Fairbairn wanted in his knives and his daggers, and he makes a big point of it, of spinning it and twirling it and tossing it up and down, and he liked the balance to be in the grip. Who am I to criticise Fairbairn, okay? He wanted that, and that's absolutely fine. For me personally, and just about everybody else in history and all other historical knives from the ancient world through medieval Renaissance to Victorian hunting knives, they all pretty much balance like a sword in front of the grip, and I personally prefer that. It's not to say this is very blade heavy, it's not. The blade's actually quite light for its size, but I prefer the balance of this. I also prefer the fact that for its size, this is lighter than the Fairbairn Sykes. It has a longer blade, it has a very slightly wider blade, okay, which I prefer, so it's just generally a bigger blade. It has a bigger guard. Why do I prefer that? Because if you're holding a knife like this and it meets resistance, you want a really good hand stop for your thumb or hand to not ride up onto the blade. I find the Fairbairn Sykes is good, especially for the size of it, but I just prefer a slightly bigger surface on there. Lastly, the grip. I've never been, I mean, obviously we've got first, second, third pattern of the Fairbairn Sykes dagger. This is the third pattern, the one that's still current issue. I'm not a big fan of any of them, really. I probably prefer the first and second pattern to this. But I don't like the fact, personally, that they're completely cylindrical. I've just never been a fan of cylindrical grips. And finally, I'm not a big fan of how little the pommels are. In terms of accessing it and pulling it out, I actually would prefer something that had a bit more of a stop at the end, like this. So, you know, I personally prefer that kind of design. And again, this is more historically tried and tested, more based on historical examples. Although, I have to say, there are plenty of historical hunting daggers which don't have any pommel at all. And that's absolutely fine. But there are other types which do. So, you know, everyone's got different tastes. So I love the Fairbairn Sykes because of what it represents, and I'm British. It's, members of my family were in the, well, still are, but were in the armed forces in World War II, and so this has a sort of patriotic historical significance, and it's still carried today, which the Dutch one isn't, as far as I know. So I do love the Fairbairn Sykes, but more for what it represents and its history. As an actual knife, if I had to go, I don't know, if I wanted to carry a dagger for going out into the field somewhere, obviously a Bowie knife or something like that would be more practical for sort of bushcraft and hunting. But if I had to carry a dagger, I'd rather carry this than the Fairbairn Sykes. I think it's easier to access, it's got a bigger grip, it's more comfortable. I just prefer almost everything about it. So there we go. The Dutch model 1917 Stormdolk. Really, really cool. Not to say the Fairbairn Sykes isn't, because I still love those as well, and I love all of the manuals and the history that goes around them. But, let's show a little bit of love to some other trench knives out there, because there's some really interesting ones. Maybe I'll come across some other trench knives. Would you like me to look out for any more? Would you like me to feature any specific ones in future videos? Get posting in the comments down below. What do you think? Do you like the Stormdolk? Would you rather have the Stormdolk or the Fairbairn Sykes? If you needed to use a dagger for some reason. But yeah, be interested to see your opinions. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton, and I will of course continue to be, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.